They built a marina on my lake, like I was already gone. Like ownership was something you could overwrite with enough signs, enough newsletters, enough fake confidence printed in glossy ink. They tied boats to docks sitting on my lake bed and sold people the idea that water obeyed whatever name Hoakaren stamped on. For 15 years, they called it Harborview Lake, repeated it until it sounded permanent, until nobody thought to ask who actually controlled what filled it. Then, one Monday morning at exactly 9:20, I turned a valve I hadn't needed to touch in 43 years, and I started taking my water back. Not loudly, not publicly, just metal turning the way it was designed to turn, redirecting flow the way the law had always allowed. By Thursday, their marina wasn't floating anymore. Boats sat crooked in exposed mud. The ramp ended in nothing, and the shoreline they thought they owned stretched out dry and silent under a sky that didn't care what they called. Before we move forward, drop a comment. Where are you watching from? One resident walked out, looked at the empty basin where water used to be, and posted 3 words that spread faster than anything Hoakaren had ever printed. Where is the water? I knew exactly where it was. It was soaking into my hayfields the same way it had been designed to do decades before any of them showed up with contracts they didn't understand. I didn't rush to explain it. I didn't need to. The truth doesn't need to argue when it's already doing the work. The water wasn't missing. It was redirected. And that distinction is the difference between confusion and control. They thought water was part of the scenery, something that existed for their benefit, something permanent because it had always been there when they looked at it. They never asked what held it there. They never checked what allowed it to stay. They assumed presence meant ownership, and that assumption is what made everything that followed unavoidable. Because when you build identity, value, and authority on something you never secured, you're not building anything real. You're borrowing time from someone who hasn't decided to collect yet. I stood on the ridge that Tuesday afternoon and watched the first signs of it. Not dramatic, not sudden, just subtle changes in the shoreline. Edges pulling back, shapes emerging where water had covered them for years. The eastern shallows were the first to go, revealing mud that hadn't seen daylight in over a decade. That's how systems work when they're built right. They don't collapse all at once. They shift exactly the way they were designed to shift when pressure changes. And I had just changed the pressure. By Wednesday, the difference was no longer subtle. The docks were sitting lower, angles off, supports visible where they had always been hidden. The waterline had retreated far enough that anyone paying attention could see something was wrong, but they didn't understand why yet. That's the part I had counted on. Not ignorance, but delay. The gap between something happening and someone understanding. That gap is where control lives. Hoakaren didn't come to me that day. She didn't call, didn't ask, didn't acknowledge anything because she still believed this was temporary, something that would correct itself the way problems usually did under her authority. That was the flaw in her thinking. She believed authority could override structure. She believed repetition could replace documentation. She believed if something had been presented long enough, it didn't matter whether it was true. Thursday morning erased that belief completely. The first residents walked down to that marina expecting the same reflection they had seen every morning since they moved in. Instead, they found absence. Boats tilted at angles that didn't make sense. Ropes slack. Docks resting where they were never supposed to touch. The ramp didn't reach water anymore. It ended in mud, stretching out useless toward something that wasn't there. The pavilion overlooked nothing but exposed silt and scattered debris, the illusion stripped away in a way no explanation had softened. That's when the question appeared. Where is the water? It wasn't just confusion. It was the first moment they realized something they depended on wasn't theirs. And once that realization starts, it doesn't stop. It spreads. It forces people to look for answers in places they ignored before. Records, documents, boundaries, things that don't care what a sign says or what a newsletter claims. I didn't respond to the post. I didn't need to. The answer wasn't something I had to give them. It was something they were about to find on their own, and that discovery would carry more weight than anything I could say. I went back inside, opened my logbook, and wrote down the adjustment. Eastern diversion fully open. Flow redirected. No commentary. No explanation. Just record. That's how you anchor something in reality. Not through statements, but through documentation that exists whether anyone agrees with it or not. By midday, more people were down there. Conversations happening in clusters. Voices low, confused, trying to piece together what had changed. Some of them blamed drought. Others blamed maintenance issues. A few suggested something mechanical had failed. Nobody suggested the truth yet, because the truth required them to admit they had built something on a foundation they never checked. Hoakaren finally appeared that afternoon. Not rushed, not panicked, but controlled, the same way she always presented herself. She walked down to that marina like she was stepping into a situation she could manage, something she could frame, redirect, contain. That's how she she had handled everything for years. Identify the issue, apply authority, maintain perception. But perception doesn't refill a reservoir. She stood there, looking at the exposed lakebed, and for a moment, just a moment, the control slipped. Not in what she said, but in what she didn't say. There was no immediate explanation, no directive, no attempt to assign blame, just silence where there should have been certainty. That's when I knew it had landed exactly where it needed to. Because this was never about the water alone. It was about showing her, and everyone else who believed her version of things, the control built on assumption disappears the second it meets something real. And nothing is more real than a system that was designed, documented, and maintained by someone who never needed their permission to use it. I didn't go down there. I didn't stand beside her. I didn't offer an explanation. I stayed exactly where I had always been, and I let the absence do the work. My name is Emmett Crane, and I don't guess, I verify. That difference is the reason everything they built eventually collapsed under its own weight. I've spent most of my life around systems that don't forgive mistakes, water, pressure, flow, timing, things that don't respond to opinions or branding or what someone wishes was true. They either work because they were built correctly or they fail because they weren't. There's no middle ground, no negotiation, no second version of reality that makes them behave differently. That understanding didn't come from theory. It came from watching my father fight land that refused to cooperate. We bought that land in 1952, 520 acres of ridge timber and stubborn ground that didn't give you anything easily. 2 streams cut through it. Unreliable, inconsistent, showing up when you didn't need them, and disappearing when you did. My father spent decades trying to force some kind of consistency out of that. Digging channels by hand, patching gates, chasing water like it was something you could convince instead of something you had to understand. I grew up watching that. Not just the work, but the pattern. The way the same problems repeated because the system behind them hadn't been solved yet. When you grow up around that kind of problem, you don't ignore it. You either accept it or you decide to fix it properly. I left, studied civil engineering, focused on irrigation, and spent years working on water systems that were expected to function under conditions that didn't allow failure. You learn quickly in that field that assumptions get exposed fast. If something isn't built right, it doesn't hold. And if it doesn't hold, everything connected to it starts to fail in sequence. By the time I came back to that land in the late 70s, I knew exactly what the issue was. It wasn't supply, it wasn't scarcity, it was timing. The water came, but it didn't come when it was needed. And without control over timing, you don't have control at all. So I did what most people don't bother doing because it takes time, precision, and patience. I built a system that solved it completely. I started with the rights. Not assumed, not imply, document. I hired a water attorney, pulled every irrigation record my father had kept since the 50s, added my own flow measurements, crop data, everything that established a clear, continuous history of use. That matters, because water rights aren't about what you think you have. They're about what you can prove you've used and maintained over time. In 1976, the court issued Decree WD-1976-00008, granting me the right to divert both streams for beneficial use on my land. No notice required, no external approval needed, because that's how prior appropriation works when it's done correctly. The right isn't based on opinion, it's based on record, and once it's recorded properly, it doesn't change just because someone else decides to ignore it. Then came the structure. In 1983, I secured the impoundment permit, WR-1983-114. In 1984, I completed the boundary survey, confirming the entire reservoir, every inch of it, sat inside my property lines. That part mattered more than anything else they tried to claim later, because boundaries don't move to accommodate someone else's plans. I built the dam myself, designed the intake, installed a diversion valve on the northern stream that allowed me to control exactly where the water went, into the reservoir when storage was needed, directly to the western fields when irrigation demanded. It wasn't complicated, it was controlled, clean, efficient, built to function the same way every time, because consistency is the only thing that makes a system reliable. And it worked. For decades, that reservoir operated exactly as it was designed to. Winter and spring filled it. Summer drew it down. Fall reset everything. No surprises, no failures. Just a system doing what it was built to do because it had been built correctly from the start. My wife used to tell me I trusted numbers more than people. I told her numbers never tried to convince me of something that wasn't true. They either held or they didn't. After she passed in 2017, it was just me and the routine, the logbooks, the maintenance checks, the field gauges, the same patterns, repeated because they work. My daughter moved east years ago, but my granddaughter Clara comes up whenever she can. She's a water rights attorney now, and she understands something most people overlook completely. A document only matters if it's the right document, in the right place, with real legal weight behind. She doesn't look at surface claims. She looks at records. That's what made her important when this situation started to shift. Because while I was maintaining a system built on documentation and structure, HOA Karen and everyone around her were building something else entirely. Something that looked solid from the outside, but had no foundation underneath. They weren't dealing with the same kind of reality I was. They were dealing with perception. And perception only holds until it runs into something that doesn't care what it looks like. That's the difference they never understood. I didn't need to argue ownership. I didn't need to prove control in a conversation. I had already done that decades earlier in a way that couldn't be undone by anyone who hadn't been part of that process. And when the moment came, when everything they built depended on something they didn't own, that difference became the only thing that mattered. They didn't start with control, they started with assumption, and then they repeated that assumption until it looked like authority. That's how HOA Karen built everything she thought she owned. Not through records, not through law, not through anything that could hold up under pressure, but through repetition, presentation, and the quiet confidence that nobody would take the time to check what was actually real. The first move didn't look aggressive on the surface. It looked like paperwork. A development plan filed in 2006 under the name Harborview Estates. Clean, professional, structured the way those filings always are. But buried inside that structure was the first fracture, the first place where perception replaced fact. They described my reservoir as Harborview Lake, not privately owned, not controlled, not restricted, just labeled, renamed, absorbed into their narrative like it had always been part of it. That's how it begins. Not by taking something physically, but by redefining it on paper and hoping nobody notices the gap between what's written and what's true. Then came the claim that made everything else possible. They stated there was an access corridor by prior agreement with the adjacent landowner. That adjacent landowner was me, and no such agreement had ever existed. Not in conversation, not in writing, not anywhere that mattered. But they didn't need it to exist if nobody challenged it. That's the calculation. If it's written, printed, approved, and repeated enough times, it becomes accepted by default. I didn't let that sit. I checked the records immediately. Deeds, easements, filings, everything that would show if there was any legal basis behind what they were claiming. There wasn't. Not a single document. So I responded the way the system requires. Not emotionally, not publicly, but in writing. Certified letter. Direct language. Private property. No easement. No access rights. Correct the filing. That should have been enough. But the system they were operating inside didn't require correction to continue. The county approved the development anyway. Civil matter, they called it. Which is another way of saying they didn't want to stop something that had already started moving forward. And once something like that gets approved, it gains momentum. Construction begins. Investment follows. Marketing expands. And the original lie gets buried under layers of activity that make it harder to challenge without stopping everything built on top of it. That's exactly what happened. The houses went up, the brochures came out, and there it was. My reservoir, printed across their materials like it belonged to them. Sunrise reflections, calm water, everything framed as a feature of the community they were selling. They didn't just use it, they built identity around it. They turned something they didn't own into the centerpiece of what they were offering. And once people bought into that, literally bought into it, the pressure shifted. It wasn't just a developer making claims anymore. It was a community believing them. By 2009, the HOA stepped in and moved from representation to occupation. They installed a marina directly on my lakebed. 40 slips, fixed structure, not temporary, not tentative, permanent in the way they built. Then came the boat ramp along my shoreline. Then, 2 years later, a pavilion, each addition reinforcing the same assumption. This is ours now, not because we secured it, but because we've used it long enough to feel like we have. I sent another certified letter. Same structure, same clarity, private property, no access rights. Remove the structures. That's the legal process. You establish objection. You preserve the record. You give the other side the opportunity to correct. They didn't correct. They responded with references to the developer's marketing plan. Not law, not documentation. Marketing. That's how disconnected disconnected their position had become from anything real. They weren't defending a right. They were defending a narrative, and the system allowed it to continue. No enforcement, no correction, just silence from the places that should have addressed it. And silence, in situations like that, becomes permission. That's where HOA Karen enters fully. When she took over in 2016, she didn't create the problem. She amplified. She understood presentation better than anyone else involved. She rebuilt the identity of that community around the reservoir completely. Newsletters, signage, website, everything centered on Harborview Lake. She repeated it until it felt permanent, until nobody questioned it anymore, until it became part of how people described where they lived. That's the power she relied on. Not authority rooted in law, but authority rooted in belief. She didn't check the records because she didn't think she needed to. From her perspective, the system was already working. The residents believed it. The structures existed. The usage was constant. Everything looked established. That's the danger of operating inside a closed loop of assumption. You stop verifying, you stop checking, you start treating perception as proof. Then she crossed the line that turned everything from manageable into unavoidable. She sent me a certified demand letter. Not a question, not a request. A demand. Dredge the eastern shallows. Install lighting near their marina. Maintain minimum water levels year-round so their slips remained usable. Instructions, directives, orders, issued on HOA letterhead, as if authority had already transferred to her. I stood at my kitchen table reading, and for a moment it didn't register as real, not because it was complicated, but because of how far it had moved from anything grounded in reality. They weren't just using my property, they were telling me how to manage it. A state-permitted, legally adjudicated irrigation system built decades before their development existed, and she was issuing operational demands on it like it belonged to her. That kind of confidence doesn't come from knowledge. It comes from never being challenged. That letter didn't escalate the situation. It clarified it, because up until that moment, there was still space for misunderstanding, for correction, for resolution without consequence. That letter removed all of that. It made one thing completely clear. They didn't just believe they had access. They believed they had control, and that belief was about to be tested against something that didn't respond to belief at all. That letter didn't make me angry. It made me precise. And precision is where things start to end for people who've been operating on assumption. I didn't respond immediately, because immediate reactions are for people who don't already have leverage. I already had mine. I just needed to make sure it was positioned correctly. So I called Clara, and she drove up that Saturday with the same focus she's always had when something doesn't line up. She didn't ask what I thought about. She asked for the documents. That's the difference between someone who reacts and someone who resolves. We laid everything out across the kitchen table, every record tied to that reservoir, starting with the original decree from 1976, moving forward through permits, surveys, maintenance logs, every piece of paper that had legal weight behind. Clara read them the way some people read faces, not looking for surface meaning, but for structure, for what holds and what doesn't. By noon, she wasn't guessing any. She called Boyd Whitaker, a property lawyer she trusted because he doesn't speculate. He verifies. Boyd didn't waste time either. He went straight to the county records, the planning archive, the water registry, every place where a real right would exist if it had ever been created. And he came back with exactly what I already knew. But now it wasn't just my knowledge, it was confirmed across every system that mattered. No easement, no corridor, no agreement, no legal basis for anything HOA Karen had claimed. That should have ended it, but it didn't. Because the situation wasn't just about what they didn't have, it was about what I did. Boyd went back through my water decree line by line, and that's when he stopped. Not because something was unclear, but because something was absolute. The language didn't leave room for interpretation. It stated I had the right to divert both streams at any time, in any quantity within the adjudicated limits, for beneficial use on my property, without notice to anyone. Not the state, not neighbors, not an HOA that had built itself on something it never owned. That line wasn't new. I had known it for decades. But knowing something and deciding to use it are two different things. And that's where the situation shifted from static to dynamic. Up until that point, this had been about boundaries and documentation. Now it became about control over movement. Water doesn't sit still because someone expects it to. It goes where it's direct, and I had full legal authority to decide where that direction went. Boyd understood that immediately, which is why he didn't stop at legal confirmation. He brought in Sylvia Oakes, a hydrologist who doesn't deal in hypotheticals. She deals in measurable outcomes. She arrived with equipment, not opinions. Flow meters, depth gauges, notebooks that never closed while she was working. She measured the inlet, mapped the eastern shallows, checked the structural positioning of the marina, the angle of the ramp, the current water line, everything that would be affected if flow changed. She didn't speculate. She calculated. A week later, her report came back sealed and exact. Full diversion on the eastern valve, under current conditions, would drop the reservoir approximately 14 feet in 72 hours. Not maybe, not possibly, measurably. At 11 feet, the docks would lose buoyancy and settle into the lake bed. At 14, the ramp would extend 58 feet short of water. The pavilion, built to overlook a lake, would face exposed silt. She included cross-sections, diagrams, data points that translated legal authority into physical consequence. That report didn't create leverage. It defined it, because now there was no gap between what I could do and what would happen if I did it. The outcome wasn't theoretical anymore. It was mapped, measured, and predictable. And that predictability is what makes action decisive instead of risky. Boyd drafted the response to HOA Karen's demand letter next. Firm, precise, dismissing every claim, reserving every right. No emotion, no excess language, just a statement of fact backed by documentation they had never bothered to read. That should have been the moment she stopped. She didn't. She sent another letter, and that's where everything became irreversible. This time she claimed the HOA had established a prescriptive easement. 15 years of use, she said, open and continuous, creating a right where none had been formally granted. That argument might hold if the owner had stayed silent, but I hadn't. I had objected in writing, certified, recorded, preserved. Once that happens, prescriptive claims don't form. The law doesn't reward use that continues after objection, it invalidates it. So when I read that letter, I didn't react. I recognized the mistake. Because that claim didn't just fail, it exposed her entire position as something built on ignoring records that already existed. And once that exposure happens, it can't be reversed. Clara saw it immediately. She didn't explain it, didn't break it down, just looked at me and said we move forward. Boyd filed suit on 3 fronts: unauthorized structures on private property, interference with water rights, formal dismissal of the prescriptive easement claim using my own certified letters as evidence against it. Copies went out to everyone involved. That was the legal side. The structural side was simpler. Monday morning, 9:20. I drove down to the eastern inlet. The access panel opened the same way it always had. The mechanism inside hadn't changed because I had maintained it the way it was meant to be maintained. Systems don't fail when they're respected. They fail when they're ignored. I checked the valve, not because I needed to, but because that's how you confirm something before you act on it. Then I turned it. Full diversion. No hesitation. No adjustment. Just complete redirection of flow from the reservoir to the western fields. That was it. No announcement, no audience, no confrontation. Just water going somewhere else. I wrote it in the logbook, closed it, and left. Because once something like that is set in motion, it doesn't need supervision. It just needs time. By the time the water started pulling back in a way nobody could ignore, the situation had already moved past explanation and into exposure. And exposure is where everything HOA Karen built began to fracture in real time. I didn't need to stand there to see it happen, because the system was doing exactly what it had been designed to do decades earlier. And when something like that is set correct, the outcome doesn't depend on observation. It unfolds whether anyone is ready for it or not. Tuesday showed them the beginning. Wednesday made it visible. Thursday removed any room for denial. The marina that had been the centerpiece of their identity wasn't floating any, and nothing HOA Karen said could lift it back in place. Residents came down early that morning expecting routine, and what they found instead was a system that had stopped cooperating with their assumptions. Boats were tilted, ropes slack, platforms sitting uneven on ground that had always been hidden beneath water. The ramp stretched forward and stopped short, useless, disconnected from the purpose it had been built for. The pavilion faced a wide stretch of exposed silt that looked nothing like the image they had been sold, and that's the moment where perception fails. Not gradually, but completely. Because once people see something with their own eyes, it doesn't matter what they were told before. The confusion didn't stay quiet. It spread fast, because confusion always does. People started asking questions, not to understand the system, but to understand why it wasn't behaving the way they expected. That question, where is the water, didn't come from curiosity alone. It came from disruption. Something they relied on had changed without their permission, and they didn't know who controlled it. That's the first step in losing authority, realizing you were never in control to begin. HOA Karen arrived with the same posture she had always used, composed, measured, projecting control, even when the situation had already slipped beyond anything she could influence. She walked down toward that marina like she was entering a problem she could manage. But the problem wasn't something she could address with words or directives. It was structural, it was mechanical, it was legal, and none of those respond to authority that isn't grounded in something real. She looked at the exposed lakebed, at the docks resting where they were never supposed to touch, and for the first time, there was no immediate explanation, no attempt to frame it, just a pause. And that pause said more than anything she could have said out loud, because it showed that the system she had relied on, the one built on repetition and belief, had just encountered something it couldn't override. By midday, the conversations had shifted. This wasn't about weather. It wasn't about maintenance. It wasn't about something temporary that would correct itself. People started looking for answers outside of what they had been told. That's when Marcus stepped in. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse. He posted a link to the county records. That was it. No commentary, no explanation, just access to information that had been there the entire time. And once that information became visible, everything HOA Karen had built started collapsing under its own weight. There was no recorded easement, no agreement, no corridor, nothing that gave the HOA any legal right to be there. And that discovery didn't come from me. It came from within their own structure. That's what made it impossible to contain. Because when the truth surfaces internally, it spreads faster and hits harder than anything external. Marcus didn't stop there. He had been asking questions long before this happened. He had requested documentation. He had asked for proof. And HOA Karen had avoided him every time. Delayed responses, redirected conversations, ignored the substance of what he was asking. He kept those records. Emails, unanswered, saved. And more importantly, he found something HOA Karen thought had disappeared. My certified letter from 2009. The one that clearly stated there was no access, no permission, no legal basis for their use of that reservoir. The one that had been received, filed, and then buried. Not lost, not misplaced. Buried, because acknowledging it would have forced them to correct something they had already built too much around. When the emergency board meeting was called, the room wasn't controlled the way HOA Karen expected it to be. Residents weren't there to be reassured. They were there to understand what had just happened to something they believed was theirs. And Marcus brought everything with him. The emails, the letter, the records. He placed them on the table in front of, side by side. No interpretation required. No argument. Just documented reality confronting assumed authority. That's when the shift became irreversible. Because once something like that is visible in a room full of people who have just watched their marina turn into mud, there's no recovering the narrative. You can't explain it away. You can't redirect. You can't outspeak it. The structure collapses because it was never supported by anything solid to begin with. HOA Karen tried to hold position. She didn't admit anything immediate. She didn't concede. She attempted to maintain the same controlled tone, the same measured responses. But the difference was clear. She wasn't directing the room anymore. She was reacting to it. And that's the moment authority flips. When you stop setting the direction and start trying to keep up with it. Residents weren't asking the same questions anymore. They weren't asking where the water was. They were asking who had the right to control it. And once that question enters the conversation, everything that had been assumed gets reevaluated at once. The marina wasn't the centerpiece anymore. It was evidence. The ramp wasn't access. It was overreach. The pavilion wasn't an amenity. It was unauthorized construction. Everything they had built to reinforce their position was now working against it. And HOA Karen had no document, no record, nothing she could place on that table that changed what was already sitting there. Marcus didn't push. He didn't need to. He let the documents do the work. That's how you dismantle something built on assumption. You don't argue against it. You reveal what's underneath it. 2 days later, HOA Karen resigned. No speech. No explanation that addressed what had happened. Just a quiet step away from a position she could no longer hold. Because once the foundation is gone, the title doesn't mean anything anymore. And by that point, the foundation had already been exposed as something that never existed. Once HOA Karen stepped down, the noise stopped, and what replaced it was something far more dangerous for anyone who had been relying on confusion to stay in control. Clarity. Not emotional, not loud, just clear. Marcus didn't celebrate, didn't posture, didn't try to rebuild authority the way she had. He did something far more effective. He acknowledged reality. That's the moment the situation stopped being a conflict and became a correction. Because once the person in charge is willing to operate inside what is actually documented instead of what is assumed, everything that follows moves quickly. He called Boyd the same day he took over as interim president. No delay, no attempt to negotiate from a position that didn't exist anymore. He understood exactly where they stood because by that point, it had been laid out in a way nobody could ignore. The marina, the ramp, the pavilion, none of it had any legal standing. The prescriptive easement claim was already invalidated by my prior objections. The interference with my water rights wasn't just a dispute. It was a violation that had been documented across multiple points in time. So instead of resisting, he shifted direction completely. They withdrew, not partially, not conditionally, completely. All 3 fronts Boyd had filed on were conceded. Unauthorized structures, water rights interference, prescriptive easement. There was nothing left to argue once the documentation was acknowledged for what it was. And that's the difference between someone trying to maintain control and someone trying to resolve a problem. One resists until collapse. The other corrects as soon as the structure fails. The settlement settlement terms came together without friction because there was no leverage left on their side. They agreed to remove the marina, the ramp, and the pavilion at HOA expense. Not gradually, not eventually, completely. Restore the shoreline to its original condition, meaning everything they had added had to be undone in a way that left no trace of their occupation. They recorded formally in the county records that the reservoir was private property and had never been subject to HOA access rights. That part mattered more than anything else because it ensured that the narrative they had built could not be revived later under a different name or a different board. They withdrew the prescriptive easement claim in writing, eliminating any future attempt to recreate it. They acknowledged my authority under the deed, the permit, and the water decree, not in conversation, not in a meeting, but in a recorded document that carried legal weight beyond anything they had ever produced before. And there was compensation language tied to the fees they had collected over the years based on access they had no right to sell. That part wasn't about profit, it was about accountability. You don't build revenue on something you don't own and walk away without correcting that imbalance. I reviewed everything carefully, not because I doubted it, but because that's how you close something properly. You don't rush the final step. You make sure every piece aligns with what has already been established. When I signed it, there was no surge of satisfaction, no sense of victory the way people expect those moments to feel. It felt aligned. That's the only way to describe it. Like something that had been out of place for years had finally settled back where it belonged. Because this was never about defeating Hoakaren. It was about restoring what had already been mine the entire time. Marcus didn't try to rebuild the old structure under a different form. He didn't rebrand it. He didn't soften it. He accepted it. And that acceptance is what allowed the correction to hold. Because once something is recorded properly, once it's placed in the system where it can't be ignored or reinterpreted, it stops being a discussion and becomes a fact. The removal process started within days. Equipment showed up where boats used to sit. Workers dismantled the marina piece by piece, pulling it apart the same way it had been assembled, except this time there was no illusion attached to it, just structure being removed from a place it never belonged. The ramp followed, then the pavilion, each piece coming down, each element stripped away until the shoreline looked the way it had before any of them decided to treat it like an extension of something they controlled. I didn't supervise it. I didn't need to. The agreement was in place. The documentation was recorded. The correction was already set in motion. Watching it wouldn't change anything. That's the difference between control and enforcement. Control happens before action. Enforcement happens after. And by that point, control had already been established. The only thing left was to let the system finish what it had already started. And it did. The next morning, before anything else in that development had time to adjust to what had already been decided, I went back down to the inlet the same way I had a few days earlier. Steady, quiet, without urgency. Because urgency implies uncertainty, and there wasn't any left. The panel opened the same way. The mechanism sat exactly where it had always been. And the valve responded the way it was built to respond. Consistent, reliable, unaffected by everything that had just unfolded above it. I turned it back. Not slowly, not ceremonial, just enough to redirect the flow into the reservoir again, restoring the same pattern that had existed for decades before anyone tried to redefine it. The sound changed in the pipe immediately. Steady movement returning to the basin, water following the path it had always followed when left alone to do what it was designed to do. I didn't stand there long. There was nothing to monitor, nothing to adjust, nothing to confirm beyond what I already knew would happen. Systems like that don't need supervision once they're aligned. They return to function without hesitation, without delay, because they were never broken in the first place. They were interrupted. There's a difference. I walked back up to the house, opened the logbook, and wrote the final entry the same way I had written every other one tied to that system. Eastern inlet restored, reservoir filling, matter closed, no commentary, no reflection, just record, because that's how things stay finished. Not through statements, but through documentation that marks the point where nothing else needs to be done. Over the next few weeks, the surface of everything they had built started disappearing in a way that didn't require explanation. The signs came down first. Harborview Lake stopped existing in print before most ready to say it out loud. The dock boxes were stacked and removed, their labels meaningless now that the structure they were tied to was gone. The pavilion stood a little longer, but not because it had any standing, just because removal takes time. And when it finally came down, it didn't leave anything behind except ground that had never belonged to them. The water rose the way it always had, calm, steady, unchanged by any of it. That's the part most people don't understand. The system doesn't care about the conflict that happened around it. It doesn't adjust its behavior based on what people believe or argued about. It returns to function the moment interference is removed. move. That's what makes it real. I stood on the ridge again a few weeks later and looked down at the shoreline. The same view they had built their entire identity around, except now it was stripped of everything that didn't belong there. No marina, no ramp, no structure pretending to represent ownership. Just water, sitting inside boundaries that had always defined, reflecting exactly what was real to nothing else. There was no one down there that morning. No residents walking the edge. No conversations trying to make sense of what had already been settled. Just quiet. That's how you know something is finished. Not when people stop arguing, but when there's nothing left to argue about. HOA Karen didn't come back. There was no follow-up. No attempt to reframe what had happened. No effort to preserve any part of the narrative she had built. Because there was nothing left to preserve. Once something is removed from record, from structure, from physical presence, it doesn't leave behind anything you can rebuild from. It's just gone. Marcus didn't try to replace it with something else. He didn't rebrand the situation. He didn't soften it. He left it exactly as it was. Corrected, documented, aligned. Because once you understand how something failed, the last thing you do is try to rebuild it using the same assumptions. I didn't go to any meetings after that. I didn't need to. My involvement in that situation ended the moment everything returned to where it had always belonged. That's the difference between fixing something and controlling it. Fixing it means you don't have to stay involved. Control means you're always maintaining something that doesn't hold on its own. This held completely, and that's why it stayed finished. A few weeks after the last structure was removed, I walked down closer to the shoreline, not because I needed to check anything, but because I hadn't stood there without obstruction in years. The ground was exactly the way it had been before any of them stepped onto it. No marks left, no indication that anything had ever been built there. Just land and water functioning the way they were supposed to. That's what real ownership looks like. Not visible through signs or claims or repeated language. Visible in what remains when everything else is taken away. I turned back toward the house. The same path I had walked for decades. The same routine. Unchanged. Uninterrupted. Behind me the water stayed exactly where it belonged, and nobody touched it after that.